If you were in the NFL, you'd be in trouble.
Maybe we could just have a moment of silence, especially we recently lost our brother Louis Beveridge. Those of you who knew him, but for him and for all the others who dedicate themselves to humanity, this moment of silence. Thank you.
Thank you.
As my colleagues know, I either like to say amen or hallelujah, whatever moves you after the end of our moment of silence. All right? We give due recognition. We're going to do, since we're a small group right now, I think it would not take too much time for us to introduce ourselves, who we are, right? We will then proceed with the greetings from Adriana Coleman on behalf of Bennett College and the Steele Hall Gallery. So, my name is James Mays. I'm the outgoing president of the East Greensboro Rotary Club.
He's a lawyer. He's a lawyer.
President and secretary, whatever, 2 or 3
He was
times.
a potshot vice chair.
And I'm now just going to go to the incoming president of the East Greensboro.
I'm Bob Powell. I'm the incoming president.
I'm sorry. I'm Mildred Powell. Incoming.
Don't get upset.
I'm Signe Waller Foxworth, otherwise known as Mrs. Mark Twain.
I'm not sure how to introduce myself. I shall introduce myself as Mark Twain, also known as Bob Foxworth, her husband.
I'm Jacqueline Cobb. I'm a member of Faith Community Church.
Good for you.
I'm Rudy Ford, East Greensboro Rotary.
Elizabeth Patterson White, 1970 graduate of Bennett College.
Amen.
I'm Carmen Lucas. I work at Bennett and I also teach sociology here.
I'm Robert Williams. I teach political science here. I'm in Dr. Lucas's department.
I'm Max Young, East Greensboro Rotary.
And we can have this, our
I'm Shatoya Rose and I'm upcoming senior here.
okay, excellent. All right, we'd like to thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm not going to take up too much space at this point. I'm going to call my colleague, Mrs. Adriana Coleman, here to give welcome.
None of our friends have shown up.
Good evening. On
Good evening.
behalf of the administration, faculty, staff, and students of Bennett College, welcome. And also East Greensboro Rotary Club. I am one of the charter members along with Max Sims, and we are proud to be able to sponsor this presentation tonight. You are in Steele Hall, which was renovated in 2004 as an art gallery. It was originally the college's dining hall, was built in 1922. We are in the process of providing exhibitions throughout the year, and we hope that you will enjoy the early years of Bennett College to reminisce. Some people come through and say, oh, I lived in that dorm. I was like, okay. But it's been a great opportunity to be able to showcase historical facts about the college. So please continue to join us and support Bennett College. We have a long-standing history in this community and in this country. So we hope that you will lend your support to us. Thank you.
So let me add my welcome. Again, Bob Powell from East Greensboro Rotary. And this is the most difficult introduction I've ever had to do. So I can introduce Bob Foxworth. He's been a friend for many years. I first met him as part of Neighborhood United, which was a Rotary function in the 1990s, building $1 million worth of houses in East Greensboro. He was executive director of that organization. And he has been, since that time, a constant voice, activist, purveyor of social justice in Greensboro, and really getting Greensboro out of Greensboro and in across the country. But somehow I've got to introduce two people because Bob's not here tonight. Mark Twain has shown up in his place. And so the person I'm really supposed to introduce is Mark Twain. Like I say, how do you do that, right? So I may have to leave it to Mr. Twain to fill in the gaps here, where he was and how he came back and how he's here and so forth. But let me ask him just one question before I bring him up. I want to make sure that we have his approval.
Yes.
For everybody to feel free to have refreshments and while he's speaking. And I know he's from a more formal time, but this is kind of a casual.
If I can't hold a crowd through that, then I don't deserve to be here.
Come on up.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you have just heard, the name is Twain, Mark Twain. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mr. Williams? Professor Williams, excuse me. Yes, right. Well, that's all my alter ego's name also, and he never shows up when I perform. I just really put out with that man. Anyway, well, I would have to say that Professor Powell's introduction was bordering on more than adequate, since he talked about that other guy so much. I don't know whether I should continue or not, but I shall tell you a bit about myself throughout the day. And you already know he's about to rise to the status of president of this august body. And I do congratulate him for that. Now, normally, not normally, but I do prefer to introduce myself. The reason is I can always, when I do that, make sure that I do introduce myself more than adequately. So, now, I also wish to express my sincere appreciation for your appearance here this evening. Despite many of you having been forewarned against it. That's quite an accomplishment. It is always gratifying for me to find another enclave of adventuresome souls afoot in this present century. Now, it has become my custom to tour the country these days merely for the sake of holding forth for the sake of it. And no longer to garner reaction to my as yet unpublished work, for there is none, and shamelessly to promote my latest book. I had two very intensive and extensive periods of touring, both of which were unofficially and officially to bail myself out of financial difficulty. The first such tour took place between 1871 and 1872. Not so curiously coincidental with the building of my great mansion in Hartford, Connecticut, which I could not afford. I gave some 80 speeches, and the proceeds from those speeches served to replenish my funds. The other, much more extensive and intensive tour was my Grand World Tour, which took place between 1895 and 1898. This is where I sought to extricate myself from a condition of insolvency. Now, mind you, I was not bankrupt, but truth needs to overrule that statement and tell you that it was a mere technicality owing to the fact that the word bankruptcy, Mr. Miles, was not as yet a part of the legal lexicon. Otherwise, I would have been indeed bankrupt. Now, I will tell you more about that story later. Now, I wish to take the liberty to indulge in a bit of shameless commercialism and to promote my latest book. But curiously and unusually, not on my behalf, but on that of the Mark Twain Project and the University of California. Now, one might reasonably ask, why is this book so long in appearing? Well, simply put, because I caused a stipulation to be entered into my last will and testament that it should not be published for 100 years after my death. Now, I indeed passed from this vale. My departure took place on April 21st, 1910, just as I had made my arrival on November 30th, 1835, on the tail of Halley's Comet. Bye. Now, as to the creation of my autobiography, it would be improper to call it writing, because beginning in January of 1906, I gave almost daily autobiographical dictations to my stenographer, Mrs. Jennifer S. Hobby, who was also a good audience. Now, the idea of randomly dictating an autobiography, as opposed to laboriously writing it out in chronological sequence, was my innovation. Now, the way it worked, I would choose a subject and expound upon it until I grew tired of it, and then I would choose another subject and expound upon that until I got tired of it, and so forth and so on. And it occurs to me that it must have driven the final editors of this work to distraction bordering upon insanity. But no matter, the reader can hear me speaking, and that is a level of intimacy I wish to achieve. As I mentioned my autobiography, I should say a word or two about the origin of my name. Those of you here, such as Ms. Boston, who have done extensive reading in my work and who are familiar with my background, are aware that my given name is Samuel Langhorne Clemens, a far cry from Mark Twain. In fact, Mark Twain's no name at all, but a sounding that indicates the Mississippi River is safe for a steamboat to travel in. By the Mark Twain! I want to make sure you weren't sleeping soundly. That is cried out by the boat's leadsman to indicate the second mark on the line, 2 fathoms or 12 feet, and therefore safe for a steamboat to travel in. Now, there are those people who infer from a hidden meaning in my nom de plume that indicates I wish to travel in safe waters in my life. However, just the briefest of glances at my adventures, both geographically and financially, would smash that into smithereens, as they say. Indeed, I have I've had some adventures in my day. Also, it may interest you to know that I first employed my name, Mark Twain, in 1863 while working as a reporter on the Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City, Nevada. Having broached the subject of commercialism, may I continue? Thank you. Even before Livy, that's Olivia Langdon, and I were married in 1870, she had her sights set upon my becoming an Eastern gentleman. Can you fathom that? And I set mine upon earning my fortune, and hence to work in the subscription publication industry to publish my books. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the subscription publication industry, this is a scheme in which salespeople travel to the hinterlands to secure advanced publications, paid of course, and to secure it. Foxworth's around here somewhere, I think. To secure advanced subscriptions to future publications at a discounted price. This was while we were still living in Buffalo and I was working on the Buffalo Press. Actually, I was a part owner. I lost money on that one too. However, I was so successful in applying this scheme to sell my books that my very first book, written in Buffalo, entitled Innocents Abroad, sold in excess of 160,000 copies. Now, to compare that, established authors of the day were managing a mere few thousand, perhaps 5,000, using conventional publishing and distribution methods. I have taken the position that anything but subscription publication is printing for private circulation. However, lest I lose my hard-earned humility, perhaps we should move on to another subject. Yes. Whereas there's gracious plenty of material in my work to fund any conversation we might have, this one and any future conversation, I think it is incumbent upon me to comment from time to time on what I see in the 21st century. Take, for example, the phenomenon of self-storage. Now, ever since my contemporary, Sigmund Freud, espoused and developed the psychological concept of self, it's obvious that it has deteriorated and devolved into a sorry state indeed. Or perhaps the mere passage of time has just identified the self for what it always was. I shall leave that for you to decide. Yes. Now, I have noticed that there is much argument about which is more important. Not always out loud type argument, but argument, much contention over which is more important, the stuff or the self. Well, I've seen in writing, and I quote, "The one who dies with the most stuff wins." Now that is distressing indeed. But it gets worse. There is also a tendency to mistake the stuff for the substance of the self. Now, what I mean by that is, recently I came upon a facility, a self-storage facility with the name Life Storage. Now that says in one word everything I have said up to this point. Now, their advertisement, though, supplies the fait accompli, the final word, beyond which no words are necessary. And I quote, "It's your life, store it with care." Now, indeed, there is not another word worthy of saying at this point in time. Before we go on, I would like to clear up a misapprehension. There is a rumor going about that I cannot quit smoking. That's a vicious and pernicious lie. Has anyone here, may I ask, ever attempted to give up smoking? Anyone here ever attempted? Oh, an honest person in the crowd. Very good. And then we know that it's the easiest thing in the world. And I know because I've done it thousands of times. Only to succumb again and again to the deliciousness of another fine cigar. Oh, but that's a lie. The cigars I fancy are so cheap and rough that I quite frequently find them discarded, unsmoked, along the drive in the wake of recently departed guests. So, however, you know that smoking is indeed a bad habit. And if one sincerely and seriously intends to break a bad habit, there is but one strategy that will work. And that is total abstinence. Why? Total abstinence is so excellent a thing that it cannot be carried to too great an extent. In my passion for it, I carry it so far as to totally abstain from total abstinence itself. I have made one exception. I used to tell lies, but I've given it up. The field is overrun with amateurs. Then there is a necessity of all of us to set a good example. That is especially incumbent upon those who are in the public eye, such as myself, and particularly upon me since the appearance of my autobiography. However, few things are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example. As an example of stomach, and not that I care for moderation myself, I've made it a rule never to smoke when asleep, and never to refrain from smoking when awake. Furthermore, I have a rule never to smoke more than one cigar at a time. Your response reminds me of a truism. Humor is mankind's greatest blessing. A great sense of humor is essential for every successful life. A mediocre one is helpful. And any sense of humor at all beats none at all. I can tell by your responses there are those here who meet and fit into each of those three categories. Those most successful among you laugh with heartiest laughter at my every quip. And as to the rest of you, well, you do indeed have my sincerest sympathy. As to having a great sense of humor, may I present myself as an example? Yes, Professor Powell, may I present myself as an example? Since my appearance in the 21st century, I have been quite frequently mistaken for the Colonel. Sanders, that is, of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame. There are many people who think I should be affronted and offended by this mistaken identification. However, I find it quite reassuring to be reminded of the Colonel, because I remember that he amassed his great fortune only subsequent to the age of 65. That tells me there's perhaps yet time for me. Now, in my quest to earn millionaire status, I invested heavily in an automated typesetting machine, believing correctly that such a machine would revolutionize the printing industry. I believe further that through the sale of such machine and the increased number of books that could be printed at a higher profit margin, I would make my million. Now, you've all heard of the linotype machine, have you not? It was only recently supplanted by computerization. Unfortunately, I did not invest in the linotype machine. Sadly enough, the machine that struck my fancy was the so-called James W. Page automated compositor typesetting machine. With a name like that, it's no wonder it weighed over 4 tons. Well, I sank a fortune into that financial abyss. In so much as $250,000, and that's a neighborhood that you would want to aspire to live in at that rate, wherever, and in whatever time it happens to be. However, reckoned in your virtually worthless money these days, it amounts to $7.5 million. Now that venture and my venture into conventional publishing with the Charles W. Webster Company drove me so thoroughly into insolvency that I had to go on tour like some kind of rock star. However, I must say to you, that machine had 18,000 moving parts. It was a thing of beauty, a true work of art. But the dang thing never worked. At the end of 1894, I owed the enormous sum of $80,000. I reckoned in this money $2.4 million, and my creditors would not rest until I should relinquish to them my copyrights. And through the advice and help of my friend Henry Huddleston Rogers, I relinquished them temporarily instead to my wife Livy until I should be able to pay my debt. I completed my grand world tour in 3 years in 1898, having visited 71 cities and regaled 122 audiences. The proceeds from those speeches, shall we say, and from the book that I wrote about it entitled Following the Equator, did that in the following 2 years. In 5 years, I was able to repay my debt with a tiny little profit of $35,000. I have no idea what I did with the money. Now, I have heard tell that I have been called the world's first rock star. Well, those adventures, no doubt, would account for that accusation. Now, all things considered, looking back on it all, I believe, and I state as modestly as I can, if I have a legacy, is in terms of real wealth, which cannot be expressed in terms of money, property, prestige, or material things, but in things, in riches of the mind and the spirit. As a cultural rock star, as a satirist and literary innovator, as an opinion maker. I could go on, but I wish to sum that up by reading to you at least an excerpt from the press release we gave as we ventured onto our grand world tour. I think it speaks to the way that I have intended to live my life. May I read it to you? This time I wait for an answer. Thank you. This is from the Paine biography, by the way. There was a nice young man followed me around for years writing about me, and I understand it's a pretty good book. It has been reported that I sacrificed for the benefit of the creditors the property of the publishing firm, Charles W. Webster, whose financial backer I was, and that I am now lecturing for my own benefit. This is an error. I intend the lectures as well as the property for the creditors. The law recommends no mortgage on a man's brain, and a merchant who has given up all he has may take advantage of the laws of insolvency and start free again for himself. But I am not a businessman, and honor is a harder master than the law. It cannot compromise for less than 100 cents on the dollar. Now, in closing, I would like to leave you with two sincere and useful thoughts. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Number two, always do right. It will gratify some people and astonish the rest. Now, finally, in closing, I close with this. It's my surefire method of living a successful life. Because life is short, forgive quickly, break the rules, kiss slowly, love truly, laugh uncontrollably, and never regret anything that made you smile. For 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did. So, cast off the bow lines, sail away from safe harbors, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore, dream, discover. Why? Be yourself if you dare. I thank you for your kind attention. Professor Powell asked if I would consider a Q&A, I believe it's called, question and answer session. I told him no, and I'm sticking to it.
Professor Twain, one question. When might we see you again?
Yes. Thank you. I'm thinking of hiring him as a publicist. You may witness this debacle. You may witness my performance somewhat altered because it will be speaking with educators, and it takes place on 2 Saturdays in August, the 11th of August at Barnes & Noble bookseller in Friendly Shopping Center, and also at that same place on August the 25th at 2 p.m. And we promise to have you extracted and ejected by 4 o'clock. Thank you.
Well, it is customary, Mr. Twain,
Yes, yes.
for our club to give speakers or presenters a small token of our appreciation.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you.
The Bennett College Social Justice Lecture Series.
Do I get tickets also?
Yes, you get the tickets, right? But you get something, I think, more important, right? And that is to continue, right, to hold forth on these important issues that you so eloquently spoke to,
Thank you, sir.
about how to be the best human being
Yes,
and to tell the truth, which means to astonish quite a few people.
yes. If any, there are some that can't even recognize it when they see it.
That's very
Apparently.
true. But this will, I think you'll find this a good read. Okay?
Delighted.
And I don't think this was done on a linotype, but nevertheless, it is a good.
Well, it certainly wasn't done on the James W. Page composite typesetting machine.
We want to thank
I thank you, sir.
thank you.
Most eloquently presented.
Okay. I will remind everybody to please sign our guest list over here. And before you do leave, we want to stay in touch with you. And what we want to do at this point is to close out the meeting. We have the usual method of closing out our meetings. Yes, Martha.
I want you to get up and pass the hat.
Presentation is on the very.
That's Bob.
YouTube, from the YouTube channel, Bennett. We have a link, and if you all would like to see the link, please, you all can, rather than the full it from this home. So watch the time.
Excellent. All right. Yeah. And you'll note also on the program, if you have a moment, you can go to youtube.com and search for the East Greensboro Rotary Club. And we have a nice little video there. A bit dated, but nevertheless, it gives you the substance and the spirit of what we try to do at East Greensboro Rotary Club. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask any of you who sat through this presentation to make any comments or observations at this time, right? So our guest here, Mr. Twain, won't answer any questions, but we can make comments. Right? Is that, any comments?
I did not say I would not answer questions. I said I would not participate in a Q&A.
Point taken. No?
Well, I'm sitting here, I watched a movie about Mark Twain, and listening to you talk, it was like I was watching that movie again.
Oh, that's such a...
It was really inspiring, and for those of us who grew up with Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and the bunch, you know, it just brings back so many good memories. So I really appreciate your presentation and keeping this part of our literature and our growing up alive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the nicest things anybody has ever said. Notice I say one of them. I would not want to exaggerate. I've done gracious plenty of that already in my life.
And will again.
Tom!
Hey.
Ah.
And one last announcement. Mr. Twain was kind enough to come here from Elmira and all those different places. So if anyone feels the spirit when they're done, we're passing the hat. So he doesn't know how to put the hat on the right way. But I guess the right way, that is the right way, because that's the way that the money goes in.
Now you have struck the purpose. You finally got it, Professor Powell.
So with that in mind, the way we normally end meetings, so the Rotarians will share this phrase with you, what we call the four-way test. And so the four-way test of the things we think, say, and do are, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair? Third, will it better friendships? And fourth, will be beneficial to all concerned. Thank you. Thank you.
That was so nice what she said.